Welcome, everyone, to this deep dive, and this time we're going to explore the life of someone who I think you'll find really interesting.
Yeah, this one's pretty fascinating.
Lev A. Vulis. He made some really significant contributions to a lot of different fields of science.
Yeah, and lived through some pretty remarkable times in history, too.
Yeah, really turbulent times. So
yeah.
We're going to kind of try to piece together both his personal and professional life.
And we get to do it from two different angles, which I think is kind of neat.
Yeah, it is.
We have, on the one hand, his official obituary, which is very, scientific and technical.
Right.
And on the other hand, we have the memoirs of his wife, Ida.
Which is really nice to have because it gives us that personal touch, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like we get to see the man behind the science.
Exactly, her eyes.
So let's begin at the beginning.
Right.
Lev's early life. He was born in Ukraine in 1912 to a family of medical professionals.
A medical family.
So you would think that he would follow in those footsteps.
Yeah, you'd think so, right? But his true passion lay elsewhere.
He was much more interested in the world of engineering. And he actually graduated from a technical school at the age of 17.
17, that's amazing.
That's incredibly young. Yeah.
Most people are graduating high school at that age.
Yeah, for sure.
So what was he up to at like 19?
Well, by 19, he was already the chief heating engineer at the Abramovich porcelain factory.
Wow.
And get this, while he was there, he actually invented a new porcelain firing technique.
Okay, I'm not a porcelain expert, but
right.
That doesn't really sound like, cutting-edge scientific discovery.
No, but it was innovative for its time and for what he was working with.
Right.
This technique involved using a special transparent paint that would turn black after firing. Mm-hmm. They called it the Black Rose.
The Black Rose, that's kind of cool.
Yeah, so even back then you can see that spark of ingenuity and his drive to experiment and innovate.
So maybe a little foreshadowing of what's to come.
Definitely.
So then in 1934, he moved to Leningrad.
A big
move. And this is where he met his future wife, Ida, at the Thermo Energy Project Institute.
Yeah, and they seemed to hit it off pretty quickly.
Oh, yeah.
Ida actually saved a note from Lev from her 20th birthday.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and even his birthday wishes had a touch of his scientific side to them.
Let me guess.
Go ahead.
He wished her a happy entry into her third decade of life.
Exactly.
I knew it.
You know him so well already.
It's just that analytical mind, right?
Yeah, always the analytical mind.
Also kind of sweet in a way.
Yeah, a little bit quirky, but definitely sweet.
So there he is in Leningrad working.
Yeah.
Pursuing higher education.
Yep.
And falling in love.
Yeah, that's a lot to juggle.
And they actually got married that same year.
They did. Ida's father was incredibly supportive, even gave them a dedicated room for Lev to study in.
Oh, that's so nice.
I know, right? A quiet space to think and work can make all the difference for a young scientist.
Absolutely. And speaking of new beginnings, their first daughter, Inna, was born in 1935.
Yeah. Ida mentions in her memoirs the bundles of joy from the maternity hospital. Like, everyone was just over the moon about this new arrival.
Yeah, I bet.
It's such a heartwarming picture of a young family,
Full of hope for the future.
Yeah, exactly.
But sadly, as we know, this period of happiness wouldn't last forever.
No, unfortunately not.
The late 1930s cast a very dark shadow over everyone's lives as Stalin's purges started.
A very dark chapter.
And in 1938, Ida's father was arrested and sentenced to 10 years without the right of correspondence.
Which is a chilling euphemism for execution.
It is. And, looking back, it's just a stark reminder of the political realities of the time.
Yeah, the fear that permeated everyday life.
Absolutely. And sadly, this experience would have a lasting impact on Lev and his family.
Yeah, it definitely shaped their lives, and sadly, it wouldn't be their last encounter with political persecution.
Unfortunately not. It's kind of crazy to think about what he was able to accomplish professionally, given what was going on in his personal life.
Yeah, it really shows his resilience.
In 1944, right in the middle of World War II, he finishes his PhD.
Yeah, talk about focus.
And by 1946, he's already publishing and teaching.
Really hit the ground running.
So while the world's in chaos, he's really making a name for himself in the world of science.
Absolutely.
And one of his early areas of focus was turbulent jets.
Right.
Could you explain what those are?
Sure. So basically, there are these really complex flows of fluids.
Okay.
Like, picture the exhaust from a jet engine, or even just like the smoke coming out of a chimney.
Yeah.
That's a turbulent jet, and they're notoriously difficult to predict.
So what did he do with those?
Well, he came up with a way to calculate their properties. Like how they spread out, how they mix with the surrounding air, things like that.
So he found a way to predict how these unpredictable things behave.
Pretty much, yeah. His method was a big breakthrough, and it was actually used by a bunch of different research groups.
Wow, so it had real-world applications.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And then he moves on to combustion.
Seems like he couldn't sit still.
Right, from jets to flames.
Yeah, he did a lot of work on how liquid jet engines operate, the thermal aspects of combustion, aerodynamics of flames, all kinds of stuff.
Wow, and somewhere in the middle of all of this, he comes up with the law of thermodynamic status.
All right, so basically it explains how the behavior of gas flows changes dramatically when they go through the speed of sound.
Okay, so the difference between subsonic and supersonic flows.
Exactly. It revolutionized how we understand those transitions.
Wow. And he figured this out in 1950 while working on his first book?
Yeah, Thermodynamics of Gas Flows. That was its title.
Talk about multitasking.
Right. I mean, think about it. Publishing a book while dealing with political upheaval, personal tragedy. It's really incredible.
He was clearly a very driven person.
Oh, yeah. No doubt it.
And not just focused on his own work either. He mentored over 40 students who completed their PhDs.
That's a huge legacy right there.
It is.
Yeah.
And it sounds like he was also interested in the practical applications of his research.
Very much so. He actually proposed a method for physically modeling these things called magneto-gas dynamic energy converters.
Okay, first of all, what are those?
Well, think of them as devices that can generate electricity from a moving electrically conductive fluid.
Like a plasma.
Yeah, exactly, like a superheated plasma.
Oh, okay. And how do you model something like that?
Well, that's where his clever method comes in. He used something called the hydrogas analogy.
Okay.
So instead of trying to build this complex, expensive experiment with a plasma, he used water to study the same principles.
Ah, so it's like a simplified version.
Right, much more practical and cost-effective.
That's pretty brilliant.
Yeah, he had a knack for connecting theory and practice.
But let's go back to the political landscape for a second.
Okay.
I mean, we talked about the purges, but how did things affect him after the war?
Well, unfortunately, even though he was this brilliant scientist, he wasn't immune to the prejudices of the time. The late 1940s saw a rise in anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union.
And that affected him how?
Well, even though he had proven his loyalty to his country, his Jewish heritage made him a target.
It's hard to believe that someone who had contributed so much could be discriminated against like that.
I know, it's a sad reality, but it happened, and a letter from his uncle in America was enough to get him fired from his job in Moscow.
A letter?
Yeah, just a simple letter from a family member.
What was so dangerous about that?
Any connection to someone outside the Soviet Union, especially the U.S., was seen as suspicious back then.
So guilty by association.
Basically,
Right.
What did he do? Well, faced with unemployment and this growing anti-Semitism, Lev and his family decided to relocate to Alma-Ata in Kazakhstan.
In 1951,
Yeah.
Voluntary relocation.
Another one of those euphemisms.
Right.
But even in Alma-Ata, his scientific drive didn't diminish at all. He kept publishing, mentoring students, even established new labs and departments.
Yeah, so he was essentially forced into exile, but he never stopped working.
Never stopped. He actually really dove into the world of magnetohydrodynamics during this time.
Magnetohydrodynamics.
MHD for short.
Okay.
It's basically the study of how electrically conductive fluids like plasmas behave in magnetic fields.
Sounds complicated.
It has applications in astrophysics, energy production, even material science.
Wow. So how did he get into that?
It seems like it stemmed from his work on gas dynamics and combustion.
Mm-hmm.
He realized that similar principles could be applied to plasmas and other conductive fluids.
So he was connecting the dots between different fields.
Exactly. He was always looking for those connections.
And he even expanded his earlier work on the law of thermodynamic status reversal to include MHD flows in 1960.
Yeah, showing that his discoveries had broader implications than anyone initially thought.
It's amazing how his work just keeps pushing boundaries.
Absolutely.
And remember that hydrogas analogy he used to model energy converters?
Oh, yeah.
Well, he used similar techniques to study all sorts of things.
Like radiant heat transfer, neutron transport in nuclear reactors, the thermal state of concrete dams, you name it.
Wow. He was applying these fundamental principles to so many different areas.
Yeah, he was a true innovator, both in theory and in practice. He also developed new techniques for measuring the properties of materials.
Like what?
Well, for example, he came up with this new calorimetric method for measuring heat flux.
So he was a skilled experimentalist, too.
Oh, yeah, no doubt.
It sounds like he made huge progress while he was in Alma-Ata.
He did, but did he ever get to go back to Moscow?
I don't know, did he?
He did in 1962. He and his family returned to Leningrad.
After over a decade.
Yeah, they settled in Pushkin, and he started teaching at the Naval Engineering Academy.
So he finally got to go back to the city where it all began.
Full circle.
What a story.
It really is, and there's still so much more to uncover, especially through Ida's memoirs.
It's incredible to think about all that he accomplished scientifically.
Yeah, it really is.
But now I kind of want to shift gears a little bit and hear more about Ida's perspective.
Yeah, her memoirs give us a much more personal look at their lives.
Like, what was it like for her and their daughters during these crazy times?
Well, she's very honest about the hardships they faced, like the cramped living conditions, the fear during the purges, raising kids with all this uncertainty.
It's easy to focus on the science and forget about the human side of things.
Right.
Was there anything in particular that stood out to you in her memoirs?
Yeah, actually one moment that really struck me was her description of Lev's reaction to the doctor's plot. This was in 1953. It was this awful period of intense anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. Jewish doctors were falsely accused of trying to kill Soviet leaders.
I remember reading about that.
It was a terrible time, and Ida says most people were too scared to speak out, but Lev's father, Abram, he openly denounced the accusations.
Oh.
He refused to believe the lies about his Jewish colleagues.
That must have taken a lot of courage.
It did, especially given the political climate, you know?
Yeah.
And sadly, Ida believes that the stress of this period contributed to Abram's death later that year.
Well, that's awful.
It just shows how deeply these events affected their whole family.
It's a reminder that these political ideologies have real consequences for real people.
Absolutely.
Ida also talks about their relocation to Alma-Ata.
Right.
And she doesn't try to make it sound better than it was.
No, she's very honest about the struggles they faced, leaving their home, adapting to a new city, the constant worry about their future.
It couldn't have been easy for Lev to leave everything behind in Moscow.
Especially after all the success he had there.
But even in exile, Ida says he never lost his passion for science.
She describes him working late into the night, always researching, always learning.
Sounds like science was more than just a job for him.
Yeah, it was a part of who he was, a way to understand the world, maybe even escape from all the chaos around him.
That makes sense.
And it's important to note that Ida doesn't portray him as some kind of cold, unemotional genius.
No.
She talks about his warmth, his humor, his love for his family.
That's nice to hear.
It makes their story so much more relatable, you know? And towards the end of her memoirs, she asks this really interesting question.
What's that?
She asks how the political landscape of his time might have influenced Lev's scientific pursuits, both positively and negatively.
That's a good question. I mean, we've touched on it a bit, but it's definitely worth thinking about more.
Yeah, on the one hand, the Soviet Union really emphasized science and technology.
Right, they put a lot of resources into it.
So that probably helped Lev in some ways. You know, he had access to funding equipment, things like that.
But then on the other hand, there was the repression, the censorship, the fear.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine trying to do groundbreaking research while always looking over your shoulder.
I know, it must have been incredibly stressful.
It's a reminder that science never happens in a vacuum. It's always influenced by what's going on in the world around it.
And that makes Lev's achievements even more remarkable.
Yeah, to be able to stay so productive and innovative despite all of that, it's truly incredible.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Lev A. Vulis' life, what are the key takeaways?
Well, first and foremost, I think his story is a testament to human resilience. He faced so many challenges, war, persecution, exile, but he never gave up on his passion for science or his love for his family.
Yeah, he never gave up on his belief in the power of knowledge.
Exactly.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope.
Absolutely.
And that curiosities, compassion, and resilience can help us overcome even the toughest obstacles.
And secondly, I think it's important to remember that history is about more than just dates and events. It's about the lives of real people.
Yeah.
Ida's memoirs give us a glimpse into that human dimension, you know, the personal struggles and triumphs that shaped Lev's journey.
They really do, and they make his story so much richer.
Exactly.
So let's remember Lev A. Vulis, not just for his scientific brilliance, but for his courage, his integrity, and his unwavering spirit.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And maybe we can all learn a little something from his story.
I think so.
That even amidst chaos and uncertainty, the pursuit of knowledge and the connections we make with others can help guide us to a brighter future.
I love that.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the life of Lev A. Vulis. Thanks for joining us.
It was a pleasure.
We hope you found it as fascinating as we did, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the world of science and history.